I think we'll start now. So it's, as I said, it's 8 o'clock, 2100 Israel time, and it's 6 o'clock UK time. So good evening to everyone. It is evening. For us, it's slightly night. Short introduction, then we'll start. We've got a very tight schedule tonight. My name is Erez David Meyzel. I'm a retired IDF Brigadier General, and I'm currently an IDF History Fellow and a member of the Haganah Heritage Association. I'm on the board with Ephraim. He's the acting lead, the acting director. So it's a real pleasure to open up what I would call a transnational event, UK and Israel on both sides, definitely a transatlantic event. It's a joint initiative of so many people, and I'd just like to mention the institutions involved. So Professor Shapiro from the Europa Institute, Bar-Ilan University, and Mr. Paul McCure from the Secret World War II Learning Network from the UK, Israel Police with Superintendent Shitrit in the IICC, Ajax, and the Haganah Heritage Association. So our topic tonight is Joint Heritage British Special Operations in Mandate Palestine, approximately 1940 to 1944, and its influence on Israel's intel community. We'll start off with opening remarks by Professor Shlomo Shapiro, the director of the Europa Institute, followed by Chief Superintendent Shitrit's presentation on Major General Wingate, basically 38, but I would say a major influence on what happened here later on all of us, especially on the IDF. Then Mr. Paul McCue, the Executive Trustee of the Secret World War II Learning Network, UK, will do his half-an-hour presentation, the longest presentation. Everybody else is about 15 minutes. And that's basically on sites and activities of British Special Operations in the northern Palestine, specifically around Haifa. That'll be a real treat for all of us. I've seen it, so I won't spoil it for you, but it's definitely got some thunder there. And followed that by Brigadier General retired Lapid Ephraim, acting Haganah Heritage Association director. He will speak about the British influence on Israel's intel community and basically the wrap-up. So really, it's like a genie. It's a lot of talent there in a very, very small space, and we don't have time. Last time I mentioned this, those not speaking, please keep it on mute. Otherwise, it does cause a bit of trouble. As you all know, it is being recorded, so we can post it later at the various sites and platforms, which is excellent. And thank you very much for all those who helped organize and all those speaking, of course, tonight. We really appreciate the effort and the time. So, Professor, you have the screen. Opening remarks, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the organizers. I'm honored to be here this evening, and very happy that you chose this topic, a topic that not many people know about, but which has exerted so much influence on Israel's intelligence. Indeed, Israeli intelligence heritage began in the era that we are discussing today. I'm also especially pleased that one participant, my friend Professor Charles Lees from the UK, is with us tonight, whose father had served with the SBS, the Special Boat Section, at their base in Stella Maris in Haifa. So hi to Charlie and everybody else. Palestine was already an intelligence hub when World War II broke up. And that had a lot to do with Palestine's strategic position, as we know, between Europe, Asia, and Africa, adjacent to Egypt, adjacent to the Suez Canal, the all-important Suez Canal, but also the events inside Palestine, the so-called Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, already focused intelligence attention, British intelligence attention, on Palestine. And indeed, the very first officer of MI5 who was stationed abroad, the so-called DSO, the District Security Officer, in 1937 was sent to Cairo, a clear illustration of the importance of the Middle East in terms of intelligence. MI5, we know that it works inside Britain. At the time, it was responsible for imperial security, and of course, the whole area of the Middle East was under British influence at the time. And of course, as war broke out, especially after 1940, Nazi armies advanced towards Palestine from two sides. They came from the north, from Vichy, Syria, and Lebanon, just across the border, and they came from the east, from Libya and Egypt. So Palestine became the heart of the conflict in the Middle East and the heart of intelligence operations. And there were so many intelligence operations in which the British jointly cooperated with the Jewish community in Palestine. I think we can spend many evenings talking about them. We will talk about some of them this evening. But I'd like to very briefly line out the framework, the actors. Who were the actors on the British side and who were the actors on the Israeli or the Jewish side, I should say? Well, there were numerous British intelligence organizations who were active in the Middle East at the time. Least of all, MI6 and MI5, which sometimes they managed to cooperate, very often they were fighting among themselves. But they were not the only intelligence organizations in the Middle East. Throughout the war, there was a whole plethora of intelligence organizations, special operations units, commando units, which were set up. Some were later disbanded, were changed into different units. And so there was a big mix of actors on the British side, sometimes causing confusion, and sometimes it had a positive effect, because when the authorities in Jerusalem weren't so keen on cooperation, then these semi-independent organizations within British intelligence could do basically what they wanted. And I will only mention several organizations, the ISLD, which stood for Inter-Services Liaison Department, or sometimes Inter-Services Liaison Bureau, which was a cover for British intelligence acting out of Cairo. SIME, Security Intelligence Middle East, which was a uniquely joint initiative of MI6 and MI5 together. Of course, MI9, which initially was responsible for evasion of pilots captured behind enemy lines. And the person representing it in the Middle East, George Taylor, played a major role in some of the largest cooperation efforts with the Jewish community in Palestine. And last but not least, the SAS and SBS, the Special Air Service and Special Boat Section, later it was called Special Boat Service, who had their base in Haifa at Stella Maris as a central base for their operations in the Dodecanese Islands, in Greece, of course, at the time, by the enemy-occupied Syria and Lebanon, which were part of Vichy France before they were taken over. And so a whole range of British actors on that side. Who were the actors on the Jewish side? Well, there was the Jewish Agency. Of course, that was the main political organization of the Jewish community, a kind of a nascent government, if you will, in the hopes at the time of having a Jewish state in the future. The Haganah was the armed branch of the Jewish community, the Haganah, the underground organization for security. And within the Haganah, there was the Palmach, the frontline units or the combat units of the Haganah, young people who shared their time training and working in kibbutzim at the time. But there were also individual volunteers who decided to tie their fate with British intelligence, who volunteered, and many paid the ultimate price for participating in some of the British special operations in and outside the Middle East during the war. The British needed Jewish volunteers in Palestine during the war for a number of reasons. First of all, British capabilities were stretched to the limit, especially in 42, 43. British intelligence capabilities were stretched all over the world. And the Middle East was perceived as traditionally being part of British influence. That is where the British wanted to have still primacy. They didn't want to let the Americans in, and they kept the strings in their hands. The loss of Greece, the Nazi occupation of Greece and Crete, came as a shock to British dominance in the Middle East. And British intelligence were desperately looking for people with skills to operate in occupied countries. They needed people who could have the languages, but also the looks, the cultural background, who could operate in places like Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, other countries in Eastern Europe, who wouldn't be noticed in the population, but also they needed people which would be reliable. Jews in Palestine, especially refugees who managed to escape Europe in the 30s or early on in the war, you could count on the hatred of the Nazis, and that assured their reliability. They weren't in it for the money, as the British recruited many other people. They were reliable. They had the looks, the languages, the cultural background, very useful for intelligence work at the time. And there were a great number of operational initiatives and cooperation efforts between British intelligence, various branches of British intelligence, and the Jewish community, the Haganah and the Palmach. If only to mention just a few of them. Attempts at sabotage, for example, 24 people who were sent on a boat from northern Palestine to try to destroy the refineries in Tripoli, in northern Lebanon. Unfortunately, they disappeared into their mission. We don't know exactly what happened to them. They were probably all killed on the way to their mission. Perhaps their boat blew up. Another initiative was the Special Interrogation Group, the SIG, who were Jewish volunteers from Palestine who trained in German uniforms as a German unit, speaking German, swearing in German, being armed with German weapons, and they were inserted as part of SAS activities behind the lines in North Africa to be the front soldiers on the way to covert operations. They could pass off as German soldiers. Some of those activities were successful, others were not successful. Many lost their lives in these activities. Perhaps the most well-known operational initiative of all, initiated by MI9, were the Jewish parachutists who volunteered in Palestine, were trained mainly in Egypt, and they were dropped over occupied Europe, especially Southeastern Europe, to help partisans in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, and other areas. Some were caught, some were sent to concentration camps or were killed. Among them, perhaps the most famous parachutist was Hannah Senesh, but there were a great many others. Some survived. Some were attached to the headquarters of Tito in Yugoslavia. Other played roles in Czechoslovakia and other countries to the east. All of these initiatives contributed to various tactical successes during the war, but there was indeed a heavy price to pay. A lot of these people did not come back and paid the ultimate price for their wish to be part of the war effort. What heritage did they leave behind beyond the individual operations? Some of the stories are quite hair-raising, are well worth studying. But if we are looking at the wider picture, what was the heritage? The war ended in 1945, and friends during the war in Palestine became enemies in the Jewish struggle for independence in the years 44 to 48, especially the difficult years 45, 46, in which all three underground movements of the Jewish side were fighting the British. And as I said, friends from yesterday became the enemies of today. And when the British left Palestine in May 1948, they left hoping never to see it again, or they left, especially intelligence people, with a lot of bad feelings. But the heritage of this cooperation was first and foremost that British intelligence during the war has trained and taught a great number of Jews the workings of intelligence, of sabotage, of communications, of covert action, things that the Jewish nation did not deal with and had no knowledge of for 2,000 years. The British were the specialists, they were the experts, and they created a young generation of people who understood about intelligence, who were trained. It was no foreign work for them anymore. And these skills, and indeed many of these people, were used as the base for the nascent Israeli intelligence services once Israel gained its independence. I don't think we can exaggerate the importance of this cooperation, this covert cooperation between the British and the Jewish people in Palestine, its importance on the development, the early development of Israel's intelligence community. But it wasn't only skills. Skills can be learned, can be taught. It was also the individual contacts between people, between British intelligence officers and the people who later populated Israel's intelligence community that helped to overcome the animosity and the bad feelings of the covert war in the later years of the British Mandate and bring British and Israeli intelligence services closer by the late 1950s. Indeed, if you look at the decade between 1948, when the British left Palestine, and 1958, when Israel and Britain cooperated together to save the reign of King Hussein in Jordan, there was a huge shift in the attitudes of both intelligence services to this cooperation. When the British left, they left very bad feelings behind on both sides. And there was little talk about intelligence. Many British intelligence officers lost their friends, literally, on the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Haifa during the Mandate years. They were not very keen to cooperate with Israel. Indeed, many perceived Israel as an enemy in the early 50s. However, the people who had already cooperation in the past, and many of those worked tirelessly to bring the services together. And within a decade, it was already commonplace for British and Israeli intelligence to cooperate. I think this was the greatest heritage that was left from the war years of this cooperation. And I think to a large degree, you can sense this heritage even in the cooperation between British intelligence and Israeli intelligence in a whole host of issues even today. Thank you.
Professor, thank you very much for that, as we call scene set. That was exactly the way to move in. Thank you so much for that. And we'll move on now to Chief Superintendent Shlomi Shitri from the Israeli Police Heritage Center, Dr. Shitri. So Shlomi, if you can, you have the screen, you have the lead, please.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Professor Shapira, for the very interesting notes. And I will go a little bit earlier to 1938, but I will begin much later. Our talk will begin on May 2.
Charge of the, not the Shah, but the Gurkhas in Burma. Yeah.
Sorry, you need to mute everybody who's not talking. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we begin on May 2, 2011, with 2 Black Hawk assault helicopters landing near a residential compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. About 24 American Navy SEAL operatives got out of the helicopters and assaulted the buildings. 45 minutes later, the helicopters took off again, taking the man and the body of Osama bin Laden, the head of Al-Qaeda and the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. Neptune Spear, the raid on bin Laden's house, is a textbook counter-terror operation. A small group of highly trained soldiers operating under cover of darkness achieved complete surprise, arrived secretly to their objective deep within hostile territory, and got out safely without suffering any casualties and with very minimum collateral damage. And today we will talk about those who wrote the very first pages in that textbook. We will talk about old Charles Wingate and the Special Night Squads. During a very short period of time, from June to October 1938, Wingate led a small military unit composed of both British infantrymen and Jewish Haganah members in a part of Galil. And during that time, the SNS revolutionized the ways in which Western armed forces fought small wars. Wingate's ideas, an example, as we shall see, mark a shift in Western counterinsurgency and counter-terror doctrine, paving the way to modern elite units like the aforementioned Navy SEALs, Great Britain's Special Air Service, and Israel's Yamam and Seret Matkal. Wingate's ideas are as relevant today as they were 84 years ago. Now, in mid-1938, Mandat Palestine was in turmoil. The Arab Revolt, which broke out on April 1936, was raging. Small Arab militant groups, which the government called gangs or bands, roamed the countryside, terrorizing the Jewish communities, Arab sympathizers of the government, and attacking small military and police units. The rebels also conducted a very thorough campaign of sabotage against the railroads, traffic infrastructure, and the pipeline leading both oil from Iraq to the Mediterranean and water pipeline, mostly around Jerusalem. Now, the Arab success to carry on an armed revolt against the British Empire in 1936 to 1939 should surprise us, because the British Army at the time was known as a colonial police. The British Army had very, very rich experience in countering revolts, in countering what was then called small wars throughout the globe. From the early 19th century to the mid-20th, they countered countless tribes, ethnic groups from South Africa to the Far East, usually very successfully. This experience led the British to develop an extensive doctrine for what we would now call counterinsurgency or asymmetric warfare. According to this doctrine, local rebels enjoyed advantages in mobility, in intelligence gathering, and in covert operations. Moreover, these uncivilized enemies, as the British referred to them at the time, were considered natural warriors who had little or no regard for their own lives. Countering such enemies in their element was dangerous, and Rudyard Kipling, in his poem Arithmetic on the Frontier, put it very, very succinctly, saying that in that kind of war, the odds are on the cheaper man, meaning the local rebel. So how do you counter a local rebellion? The solution is to exploit the British Army's advantages, mainly in firepower, in technology, cohesion, discipline. Here, for example, we see light tanks, which the British Army deployed in Palestine during 1936 to counter the first phase of the revolt. The idea is to amass forces and to sweep the countryside with drives, gathering men, taking them to concentration camps, and whenever the rebels get out and fight, destroy them by use of massive power. Now, the Arab rebels in Palestine easily evaded such drives when they were tried here, and we will see why, hiding in their villages until the soldiers left the area and then resuming the attack. Now, in order to prevent local rebels from achieving successes and from causing casualties to the military, British doctrine strongly advised against employing small units in offensive operations. And you can see here that the smallest unit that should be used on an operation in the Arab Revolt was about a company sized, about 100, between 85 to 100, 120, 130 men. Now try and surprise someone in the hills of Samaria with 140 soldiers, especially when they are getting there on their 40 trucks. You understand why the Arabs had a very, very easy time evading British drives. In addition, the doctrine explicitly warned from mounting night operations. And you can see here, to carry out offensive night operations of any extent was to invite casualties from an opponent more at home in the dark than the British soldier. And lastly, the British supposed that the enemy will always have the upper hand in the field of intelligence, that the rebel is more capable of gathering information on the military and of operating covertly without military gaining any information regarding it. Now, there was even a very explicit warning from trying to adopt rebel methods. It is useless for British troops to try to beat this kind of enemy at his own game. However, necessity is the mother of invention. During 1938, international tensions prevented Britain from carrying out its own doctrine. Due to the risk of renewed conflict, either in Europe or in the Far East, the British could not reinforce the Palestine garrison, and therefore the army in Palestine had to do with his forces on the ground, which at the time amounted to 2 brigades, the Palestine Police Force and the Transjordan Frontier Force, in addition to 2 Royal Air Force squadrons. In early June 1938, a young 35-year-old captain, or Charles Wingate, then an intelligence officer, submitted to his commanding officers a proposition to form a new kind of military unit, the Night Movement Group. This would be a small joint British-Jewish unit which would supplement the army's daylight operations by patrols and ambushes at night. The goal for that unit was to put an end to terrorism in northern Palestine. In his memorandum and in other writings, Wingate openly criticized common wisdom. For example, noting that night is the weapon of offense, and that the military should operate offensively at night. In addition, there was no doubt in Wingate's mind that small parties of troops and police could, without undue danger, attack very much larger bodies of rebels at night. The habit of reckoning the rebels as good as armed forces should be reversed. Wingate even explicitly said that he wants to create a government gang, meaning to adopt the rebels' doctrine, the rebels' methods, and use them against them. Now, the SNS, which was formed in early June and operated under the command of the 60th Brigade, which was then stationed in northern Palestine, was a very small unit. It composed of 3 squads taken from the 3 infantry battalions of that brigade, each about between 12 to 18 men strong, with 1 British subaltern, lieutenant or second lieutenant, and additional 75 to 100, depending on the period, Jewish supernumerary policemen, all of them Haganah members. This was very well known to the British at the time. Now, Wingate was the officer commanding of the unit, and he had a Jewish agency liaison officer who helped with maintaining the unit, with financing the unit, and with intelligence operations. Now, Wingate wanted to include Jews in his unit because he was a Zionist, because his professed goal was to command the Jewish Legion when that would eventually be formed. Why did the British Army agree to employ Jews in such a unit? Well, it's very easy to understand. If you take 1 platoon, 40 soldiers from the British military, and add to them 80 Jewish supernumeraries, then for the price of 1 platoon, you get a company. A company which the Jewish agency, by the way, pays half the pay, and the other half comes from the British police. So the army doesn't have to pay anything. It's very, very cost efficient. That's why that unit was formed. And the Special Night Squad was billeted in Jewish kibbutzim, mostly in Emek Israel, the Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine. And its main goal at the beginning was to protect the Iraqi Petroleum Company's pipeline, which passed through the valley. The unit, as I said, operated under Wingate for only 4 months until mid-October 1938, and then until early January 39 under Wingate's second in command, H.E.N. Bredin, and after that it was not disbanded, but it stopped operating according to Wingate's ideas and doctrine. The SNS operated offensively. Wingate sent out his men at night in small patrols, numbering between 10 to 40 men, to comb the countryside, to look for rebels, and usually to operate according to information which he gathered with the help of the Jewish Muhtars, the heads of the Jewish settlements. This led the SNS to a very, very unprecedented success in the Arab Revolt. For the 6 months from June to December 1938, we can see that the SNS was responsible for 17% of all enemy casualties in all of Palestine, and for almost 20% of all armed seizures in all of Palestine. Now, these two numbers were numbers which the British Army followed at the time, and the British Army checked its success to counter the revolt by body count and by numbers of weapons armed. Now, if we take into account that at the beginning of that period, in June 1938, the Special Night Squads was 1 company out of 2 brigades, but by December, it was 1 company out of 1 corps. This picture is truly, truly impressive. Now, the British command was not blind to this extraordinary success, and we can see that in a report from May 1939, it said that a few highly trained night squads and ambush patrols can have greater moral and material effect than columns, meaning that the British Army understood that it has to adapt its own doctrine. And in notes on the lessons of the rebellion, again from the end of 39, the principal difference between the doctrine at the beginning of the revolt and 1939 is with regard to night operation, and it has been fully proved that the Arab is no match for highly trained British infantry at night. This was due to Wingate's lessons. Now, the British Army emulated Wingate's idea by forming special night squads throughout all infantry battalions in Palestine, mostly without Jewish supernumeraries, so we know very little about these units, but every battalion had a special night squad or a Q platoon or an ambush patrol, as it was known then. Moreover, as the time progressed, even regular units adopted Wingate's methods by patrolling at night, raiding, etc. How did the SNS influence the Jewish Defense Force? Well, this is a very famous picture of Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Sadeh, and Yigal Alon taken in 1938, when both Dayan and Alon are supernumeraries in the British Mandate Palestine Police Force. All 3 men participated in SNS activities. Now, none of them were officially a part of SNS, but both Dayan and Yigal Alon, as commanders of mobile patrols in the Galil, operated alongside with Wingate, and Yitzhak Sadeh was the first liaison officer to operate with Wingate, and he assisted him in establishing the unit. Now, very shortly after the formation of SNS, Haganah Command understood that they had a masterclass. So they started rotating as many men as they could through Wingate's hands. So it's very difficult today when I'm asked who served with Wingate, who were the men who were part of SNS. There are very few names that served throughout the entire 4 or 6 months with Wingate. because Haganah understood that they have someone who you should learn from, and they just sent whomever they could. Some of them were later very, very high-ranking officers. Shimon Avidan, the first commander of Givati, is one of them. Pinchas Koppel, the first commander of the Israel Border Police, and others. Even Yaakov Dostrovsky, Yaakov Dori, the first Israel chief of staff, worked with Wingate on a certain project. Now, in 1940-41, there was another military collaboration between the British Army and the Haganah, the Palmach. The name Palmach is very, very similar to the Hebrew name of the SNS, Plagot Laila Miuchadot, or as it was named in its acronym, Palam. This is probably not coincidental. After the establishment of the State of Israel, Wingate's memory was still going on, and Unit 101, formed in 1953, bears a very striking resemblance to the SNS. And it's interesting to note that Moshe Sharet, the prime minister, worked very closely with Wingate. David Ben-Gurion, the defense minister, knew Wingate and even wrote regarding Arik Sharon, the commander of the 101, in his diary, that there is something of Wingate in Sharon. And Major General Avraham Yaffe, one of the SNS squad leaders, said that the experience of working with Wingate was very lucky for the young Jewish state in being, because it said that it was our first meeting with a regular army officer, and luckily this was Wingate. We were influenced by an original and creative officer. He was an Orthodox, and that was our luck. Today, we can find Wingate's fingerprints on every special unit, both in Israel and throughout the world. We can see the government gang, the unit which takes and combines the advantages of the regular army in mobility, in cohesion, in technology, with that of the local rebel, in covert operations, in intelligence gathering, in the ability to use ruses. And Israel, and not only Israel, the Western world in general, has used this experience to very, very good effect. So we will part with this quote of Wingate, which I think is always relevant, although it doesn't, it's not connected to our topic directly. And thank you very much.
Chief Superintendent Shlomi Shitrit of the Israel Police, Dr. Shitrit, thank you very much. That was great. That was a really, really good lead-in. In fact, it makes it even, I think, even easier now for Paul to continue his presentation on basically sites and activities in the north during the war, during the World War II. Of course, in Palestine, there were some other interesting characters as well that were involved in this activity, such as Dudley Clark, who was afterwards very much influential in setting up the commandos, of course. And even Simmons, which we'll hear about soon, was not totally disconnected to Wingate and to the SNS. So that was great presentation. Thank you so much. Paul, you have the floor, you have the screen. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about British operations north. I would just say that I stray a little bit south as a result of one or two recent discoveries. A little bit about myself. I'm going to run through this very quickly. I'm a military historian and author. I'm in retirement. I've been spent 30 years in public and regional government service, and then retired as a managing director of a London-based leisure and culture company. Although I haven't got a military background, I was a former armed forces advisor to one of the boroughs in London, and I now, in retirement, work as a military historian and author, consultant and lecturer. You see some of my responsibilities there. My wife's always saying I'm not at home, and tonight I'm talking to you as an executive trustee of Secret World War II. Just to tell you a little bit about that, we are a UK-based educational charity. We have three main aims: educate, commemorate, and inspire. Here you see one of our education aims, which is to try and get to younger people. And we tend to find that only from the ages of about 16 upwards can we interest people in the subject. And I think if you look at the people tuning in tonight, the average age is somewhat over 35 or 40, I would say. Commemoration, here you see examples of what we do in terms of plaques and information boards, not only in Great Britain, but with a program extending to Israel amongst other countries. And inspire, and a lot of inspiration is regarding the current and future generations of the military, again, both at home and overseas. So you see examples here of signallers in Great Britain, the Intelligence Corps, the Defence Unit, the Royal Air Force, a series of presentations to them. And then, thanks to the IDF, a tour of Israel back in 2019. My particular connection, started with an event at Brookwood Military Cemetery in Britain, which is the largest British military cemetery. And this year saw the 6th consecutive year of commemorating the Special Operations / Palmach Operation Bosun of the 18th of May 1941. And you heard Shlomo Shapiro mention this earlier on. And this followed the efforts of the Ajax archivist, Martin Sugarman, to have their names added to the 1939-1945 memorial to the missing, which you see here. Their British liaison officer, Major Sir Anthony Palmer, had been included since the memorial was inaugurated in 1958, but the young Jewish lads from Mandate Palestine had been omitted. Now they were added thanks to Martin Sugarman. Just a reminder what that operation was about. Again, as Professor Shapiro said, this was an attack on a Vichy French oil refinery just near Tripoli in northern Lebanon. And there are the 23 Palmach Jewish volunteers and their British liaison officer who were lost on Operation Bosun in May 1941, just days after the Palmach had been formed. At the annual ceremony, you'll see here, we always have good support from the embassy, in particular the defense attaché and his assistant, and indeed from Ajax. So you can see some of the Ajax officers there at top right who are tuning in this evening. And we also welcome visitors who are descendants of the names on the memorial to the missing. So here you see top left Iftach Spector, Professor Dan Lebanon at top right, and Ambassador Gershon Gann, who comes back very regularly. He's in the UK at the moment, I believe, and hopefully tuning in. And he is a descendant of the skipper of the boat. Content of my presentation tonight, I will cover just one element of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, otherwise known as MI6, and that's Section D. And Section D's operations in Palestine commenced from June 1940. Something called GR, with a headquarters in Jerusalem. They conducted a seaborne raid into Syria from Haifa in June 1941. And something I recently discovered, a sabotage training school at Imwas near Latran from July 1941. Then the Special Operations Executive, they had something called Military Establishment or Special Training School number 102 on Mount Carmel, several sites. At Atlit, there was weapons training, swimming and boating training. At Mishmar HaAmek, there was the Palmach training. At Megiddo, there was a finishing school, which I think was an addition to ME 102. And then also further south on the Yakon River and in Tel Aviv itself. Continuing with the content, I will then touch on the Special Boat Squadron of the SAS at Atlit, the Special Raiding Squadron of SAS and Headquarters Middle East Raiding Forces at Achziv, the Parachute School at RAF Ramat David, the Close Quarters Battle Course in Jerusalem, which also serves Special Forces, Army, Police, etc. And as I say, other than touching briefly on Section D, presentation doesn't cover SIS, MI6 activity, or indeed MI5 activity, which was mentioned earlier as well. So we start with section D. D reputedly stood for destruction, and this was a section of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS or MI6, and its presence in Palestine, as I said, began in June 1940. Section D was overtaken and taken into SOE in the latter half of 1940. It had three main aims in Palestine: provision of agents capable of demolitions, the establishment of arms dumps, and the identification of targets, including in Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. Its early involvement with the Haganah in 1940 was via someone called Professor Arnold Lawrence, and he was in section D. And Lawrence recruited two people, officers called Hammond and Burns, and they trained the Haganah in sabotage techniques at the Beit Oren kibbutz on Mount Carmel, using the nearby Kudumim quarries for training with explosives. Here you see Arnold Lawrence, yellow circle below, with his brother, who was Lawrence of Arabia, marked with a red star in this family photograph on the left-hand side. And below you have a photograph of Nick Hammond. I've not been able to source a photograph of the third officer called Burns. A very good and interesting description of the people who were being trained originally by Section D and then SOE. They were described in a UK National Archives file as honourable fanatics who will stick at nothing, physically and mentally tough, highly disciplined, and used to guerrilla warfare. No better human material could exist for our purpose. And when they say used to guerrilla warfare, as I put there, probably that is those who were experienced through Wingate's special night squads. As I say, Section D fell foul to the introduction of SOE, and so the three people involved were transferred after July 1940 to SOE. Lawrence fell out of favour. He was seen by the Jewish agency as being too in favour of his brother. He was trying to defend his brother's reputation, Lawrence of Arabia. But quite a bit of anti-Semitism criticism had been thrown at Lawrence of Arabia. And so as his brother Arnold tried to protect his reputation, so he was viewed with suspicion by the Jewish agency. However, Hammond and Burns continued until, while Hammond was on an operation in Greece, Burns was arrested at the Kudumim quarries, which are pictured here, and he was beaten up by the Palestine police. His morale was so affected by that that his heart was no longer in the task, and he was then transferred away. The next element I'm going to cover is something called G(R). This was a sub-branch of MIR, Military Intelligence Research, part of military intelligence within GHQ, General Headquarters of the British Army. The GR element of it managed to survive the takeover of MIR by SOE in 1940. So exactly like Section D of SIS was taken over by SOE, so was MIR. But GR managed to survive this. It left the intelligence fold, it was described as that at the time, and became the cover name for the Directorate of Special Operations of Military Intelligence. It was also described as having no connection with, but a first cousin of Force 133. And Force 133 was the Special Operations Executive. The basis of GR, it had a headquarters in Jerusalem, and there is evidence of an offensive operation, at least one, in June 1941 in support of the invasion of Lebanon and Syria. But also from July 1941, and this is the element which I've only discovered recently, its Latran Training Center was brought into being, and it was established to instruct on sabotage techniques. I mentioned that there was at least one offensive operation. Here you see the evidence of it from British files in the National Archives, UK National Archives. On the night of 7th of June, there was an 8-man attack by motorboat from Haifa on telephone lines near Beirut, and one man was lost. Corporal Rappaport of Tel Aviv was drowned. I would just say that this, as I say, has only recently come to my attention. We have a member of our network on a battlefield tour of Egypt at the moment. Corporal Rappaport is named on the Alamein Memorial to the missing, and our member was able to place a small Star of David at that memorial below Corporal Rappaport's name only last week. The training school I mentioned, the Latran Training School, it was located in a monastery. I originally thought that that might have been the quite famous Latran monastery, but no, it's just down the road at Imwas. It was then a Carmelite monastery of Emmaus Nicopolis. It's now a French order that are there. And it was opened on the 18th of July 1941 as it had been vacated, and only one Irish priest remained on the premises. And here you see, again, an excerpt from the UK National Archives, which on the 18th of July 1941, it mentions that Imwas Monastery was opened as a GR training centre, and the first week's training programme began. There's the location of it. And so, as you see, you've got Latran over here, almost in the centre of the map, and to the northeast is the monastery of Imwas. Here it is today, an aerial view and a close-up. At the training school, they gave lectures and practical demonstrations on security, small arms, target identification, explosives, demolitions, sabotage of roads and railways, and Arabic language. And looking at the people who contributed amongst the instructors and the staff of GR was Glub Pasha. He was then Lieutenant Colonel John Bagot Glub, later Lieutenant General, pictured on the left. In the middle, Lieutenant Lawrence van der Post, well known in Great Britain because he later became a mentor to what was then Prince Charles, now King Charles III. And on the right-hand side, Lieutenant Prince Ali Khan. And their specialist training included giving instruction to the commandos and the Special Air Service Regiment. Here you see an example of the programme of work in the first week, taken again from UK National Archives. GR later established a branch at Brumana, east of Beirut in Lebanon, and started to look to move from Imwas in January 1942, when it was decided that they would be reorganised and become part of the new Middle East Commando. They continue their war diary as GR, but as part of 9th Army, until they moved to Jebel Arbain, which was 50 kilometers north of Homs in Syria in March 1942. So that's when they left Imwas. Special Operations, SOE. This was the organization which was set up in July 1940, and it was then ordered by Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, to set Europe ablaze. It very quickly went beyond Europe to the Middle East, to the Far East, to Australia, etc. According to its charter, it was to engage in sabotage and subversion, but not to act as an intelligence service. It was headquartered in Cairo in the Middle East as Force 133 and also had a Jerusalem office. The first field commander for Palestine was someone called Mr. Bevel Wilson, but he was actually a Major General retired, and you see photographs of him there. And the SOE liaison officer for working with the Jewish agency and the Jewish community, who were known as the Friends by the British, was Lieutenant Aubrey Iban, later Abba Iban, late of the South Staffs Regiment of the British Army, and he worked out of a villa in Jerusalem in 1940 to 1943 when he transferred from the British Army as an intelligence officer to join SOE. His records actually show him as being first recruited by Section D in September 1940, although by then Section D should have been termed itself SOE. ME 102, which I touched on earlier, also called Special Training School 102 and Special Training Centre 102, was on Mount Carmel above Haifa from August 1941. The first trainees seem to have gone through there in October 1941, following a 6-week paramilitary course. It was set up by someone well known in Israel, I think, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Simons, pictured on the left-hand side there, with help from the Jewish agency, especially Moshe Shertok, later Sharet, and David Hakohen were also pictured there. The 6 weeks training syllabus consists of demolitions and sabotage, weapons, marine, boat training, swimming, motor transport, map reading, compass and use of ground, unarmed combat, observation, Morse code and photography. So quite an extensive syllabus over the 6 weeks. But where exactly was it on Mount Carmel? I think someone has already referred to it, that I think Professor Shapiro, that it was at the Stella Maris, and that is correct to some extent. This is something that I've been discussing with Erez Meizel at some length, and we are agreed, I think, that there were apparently several schools or wings as part of SDS 102, ME 102. And one of those centres was described as giving sabotage and foreign weapons training in an old police barracks on Mount Carmel. In the grounds of the monastery, which I've just mentioned, Stella Maris Monastery, and there, outlined in yellow, you will see that behind the monastery, which is pictured below at the time, there is quite an extensive area of ground which was occupied by the British Army, and indeed still has IDF presence there today. But also in an old sanatorium in Ahuza. This was an SOE training and holding unit for radio operators, and it was from this site that we know that the weapons were stolen back by the Palmach in 1943 from an armory in Yaharot Street. That is now the IDF Junior Command Military Academy, which you see pictured there. And Erez Meizel was responsible for having a commemorative plaque put up to that stealing back by the Palmach. The Palmach had been had their weapons taken away from them by the British as the threat of German invasion receded, and so a week after they were taken from them, they took them back. And Megiddo, I believe, was an element of ME 102, and this is for certain that it was used for SOE, for paramilitary training. They used the University of Chicago building. It was referred to as Group B training by SOE, and if that mirrors what happened in Great Britain, then it was finishing school, so a school where they would continue to instruct on paramilitary skills, but also instruct on the enemy's activities, forces, and organization in the country to which SOE agents were bound. Tony Simons was supposed to be the first commandant of ME 102, but he was then recalled to Middle East Forces headquarters in Cairo to join and head up the local MI9, which we've touched on already this evening. So the first commandant of SDS 102 was Major Kid Cater, pictured below left early in his military career. He had served in the First World War. And supposedly Major Hector Grant Taylor, pictured below right, was also sent as commandant. As he was on his way, it was found out that Kid Cater had already been appointed. So instead, Hector Grant Taylor was designated as Chief Weapons Instructor on Mount Carmel at ME 102. But there was clearly tension. He'd missed out on the top job, and he was not happy being there. So Grant Taylor was replaced by, as Chief Weapons Instructor, by Major Patrick Leigh-Fermor, again, a very well-known Special Forces officer in Great Britain. And it was Leigh-Fermor who used the ruins of the Crusader Castle and Atlit Bay for weapons and canoe and swimming and limpet mine training. And indeed, from November 1941 to January 1942, he had a party of Greek trainees actually based in the Crusader ruins at Atlit. As I say, Leigh-Fermor is a very well-known name in Great Britain as a Special Forces soldier. And there you see photographs of him. On the right-hand side, the chap in the middle is General Kreiper, who was the German commander of Crete. And on the left-hand side, you see Leigh-Fermor and his colleague Stanley Moss, the two of them went from the Middle East over to Crete and captured Kuiper and brought him back out to Egypt. So a very famous operation in Great Britain, talking a film on the subject. SDS-102, ME-102 closed in July 1944 when it moved to southern Italy. And at that point, its total had been the training of 400 officers and 700 other ranks, largely for service in the Balkans. I said I would also cover briefly the close quarters battle course in Jerusalem. This operated from 1941 to 1942. It was when Major Grant Taylor had his nose put out of joint by not becoming commandant at ME-102 at Mount Carmel. So he went off to Jerusalem, and while still in SOE, started a close quarters battle course. Here you see a photograph of him instructing General McConnell on the Tommy gun. I'm not sure where in Jerusalem, but he covered not only the special forces of the SAS and SOE, but also the General British Army and the Palestine Police. And his instruction course was renowned as for close quarters. The main SOE activities, in addition to training people to go into the field in the Balkans, in May 1941, a group of toughs were recruited via the Irgun for an abortive attempt to break the Iraqi revolt of Rashid Ali al-Gailani. In May 1941, as I said, Operation Bosun, where training was undertaken in the Yarkon River and in the fairground in Tel Aviv. And there were intelligence and sabotage missions in support of the June 1941 Allied invasion of Lebanon and Syria. Moshe Dayan was one of the people involved in those. The Operation Bosun training, as I said, the ground training in the fairground in Tel Aviv and boat training on the mouth of the Yarkon River just by Tel Aviv. And the chap circled with a yellow circle there is believed to be Nick Hammond, who I mentioned earlier, started out with Section D and then moved into SOE. And in April 1942, in addition to the earlier very undercover training of Jewish paramilitaries, the SOE began a formal Friends scheme, also known as the Palestine scheme, in support of the Carmel Plan, which was the plan to protect the Haifa region and Mount Carmel in case of a German invasion reaching the area. 2-ton dumps were set up at Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, and Samak. And the training of Palmach saboteurs was commenced originally 150, but then increased to 400, consisting of 153 instructors and leaders in 1 month, and then 250 volunteers to be trained by them over 2 months in demolitions. Use of all toys was the term used. That means all sorts of weapons and explosives. And road cratering was to be a priority. So there were to be stay behind units and to crater the roads, especially in the event of a German invasion of Mandate Palestine. The training was concentrated from a range of establishments which had been used for the special night squads into a camp at Mishmar HaAmek, which was under the command of Royal Engineers Officer of the British Army and SOE. And the training was to be finished by July 1942. Here you see a photograph of a British instructor of the Palmach, Company Sergeant Major Jumbo Steele. But there were difficulties over the Friends scheme, and Bevel Wilson, the retired Major General, had to resign in June 1942 when it became clear that he'd had no financial authority from Cairo to start the Friends scheme. So temporarily all training was halted at Mishmar HaAmek, and stores were returned to SDS-102 on Mount Carmel. However, it was only a temporary hiatus. Mishmar HaAmek restarted for 2 weeks for the testing of trainees. Initially, it was realized that there'd been no testing of those who'd already trained, so it was opened up first of all for that. And then it continued with a revised Palestine scheme, no more than 160 men to be trained by SOE Palestine, including 24 radio operators. And there were stricter controls now put onto the scheme. The men were not to be mobilized until ordered. They would come back to Mishmar HaAmek each year for 2 weeks training. And there were 60 to 70 at a time in the camp. The last course was in October 1942, and our old friend Grant Taylor was running the camp at that time, and it was then closed. So the idea of coming back for 2 weeks training each year was abandoned, and the British changed their views about the opportunities that would be offered by having trained members of the Jewish community, because as I said earlier, the threat of German invasion had receded. So I would just mention as well, SOE had a directorate of special propaganda for the Balkan section of it, and they ran a number of freedom stations, which promulgated cartoons, whispers, and rumors against the enemy. In Jerusalem, they covered Greek, Romanian, and Yugoslav matters, and from Haifa, they covered Hungary and Bulgaria. That was centralized temporarily in Jerusalem after September 1941. Moving on from SOE, from April 1942, the 1st Special Air Service Regiment, 1st SAS, moved to Mandate Palestine from its depot base in Egypt. At this point, it was divided into 2 elements: the Special Raiding Squadron, which was based at Achziv, and the Special Boat Squadron, which was based at Lit. There's been a lot of confusion over the years amongst the British and I think some of the Israeli military about the Special Boat Squadron, but it was the Special Boat Squadron, so it was one of 2 squadrons of the Special Air Service, still very much part of the Special Air Service, and was not the Special Boat Section, which was created also in the Second World War, nor is it the predecessor of today's Special Boat Service, which is part of the Royal Navy. So the Special Boat Squadron at Lit, this was its depot base and training base for seaborne raiding in the Eastern Mediterranean. It used the 11th Schooner Flotilla, based generally in Beirut, for getting to the Greek islands in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its officer commanding is pictured on the right there, Major the Lord Jellicoe, and one of the most famous officers of the SAS was Captain Anders Lassen, below left. He was later killed in action in Italy in 1945 and was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, the highest decoration in the British military. And there you see a photograph of 11th Schooner Flotilla personnel and Special Boat Squadron personnel returning from an operation in the Eastern Mediterranean. You'll note that quite a few of them are wearing elements of German naval uniform. There's just a map showing where the SAS camp was. So the Special Boat Squadron of the SAS were in a tented camp at the southern end of Atlit Bay, in contrast to the SOE weapons training and the Greek camp, which I mentioned earlier, which was in the Crusader ruins at the north end of the bay. The Special Boat Squadron at Atlit had an establishment of 230 officers and men, with a core element of 3 operational detachments numbering 60 men, based on 5 patrols, 10 strong, with a headquarters and signals team. And those 3 detachments were named after their founders: L for Langton, M for Maclean, and S for Sutherland. And here you see photographs of them at Atlit in their tented camp. The Special Raiding Squadron at Achziv, and also very close by was headquarters Middle East Raiding Forces, which covered the long-range desert group, the Greek Sacred Squadron, the 11th Schooner Flotilla under Brigadier Cater. So the man who had been commandant at ME 102 went on to become the head of the Middle East Raiding Forces and was later replaced by Brigadier Turnbull. The officer commanding of the Special Raiding Squadron was again an exceptionally well-known in Britain SAS officer. Here you see him on the left in the North African desert, and on the right at the end of the war, Major Paddy Mayne, credited with destroying more enemy aircraft on airfields in North Africa than the RAF did. And at Akziv, they were training for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. We have a description of where it was. I'm due to be in Israel in December to try and pin this down. I think Erez will know exactly where it is. It's on a hilltop, 1 to 2 miles south of Akziv village, 1 to 2 miles north of Nahariya, and 1/4 of a mile in from the coast. So I think that's somewhere near Gesher Hazim. And here you see photographs at Akziv and also off the coast, going up the coast into the Lebanese border as well, where they practice with landing craft for the invasion of Sicily. Here you see a menu from Christmas 1943, Special Raiding Forces at Akziv. Number 4, Middle East Training School at RAF Ramat David is the next location. This was the parachute training school for Special Forces, SAS, SOE, and MI9. We've already touched on the first Jewish parachutists who will need no introduction to most of the people in Israel. And there you see some of them pictured, including on the right, Hannah Zenez, who was mentioned earlier. They all did their training at Ramat David. Some of them, I'm sure, have been through the Palmach training in Mandate, Palestine, but otherwise they were going backwards and forwards from the Cairo headquarters of MI9. At Ramat David, you had 2 days ground training for day jumps, 4 day jumps, sorry, and then 1 night jump. There you see photographs from Ramat David. And I finish with mentioning our network's proposals in Israel. We would very much like to try and cover some of the items I've talked about tonight by putting up plaques or information boards at the locations, at Akziv, at Imwas, at Atlit, at Mishmah HaAmek, and at Megiddo. So when I come over in December, I hope to pursue those ideas and talk to people at the various sites as to the potential for that. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Great, Paul, thank you so much for that. It's really interesting, and in fact, it makes a lot of sense when you think about where we started from with Wingate, and of course with the professor's opening remarks. We'll move on now to the wrap-up, basically, by Dr. Retired General Ephraim Lapid, the acting director of the Haganah Heritage Association. Ephraim, please, you have the screen, you have the lead.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad on behalf of the Association of the Heritage of Haganah to see this evening as, if you want, an international opportunity to convey our messages here and there, and especially after the amazing presentation of Paul. We watched a Zionist history expressed by Paul, and after also the preface of Shlomo Shpiro and Shlomi Shitrit, I like to conclude the history of 30 years, really 30 years, from 1917 to 1948. Next week, we will celebrate November 2nd. And November 2nd, 105 years ago, 1917, was for the history of Zionism, for the history of the Jewish world, for the history of the Jewish community in Palestine, was a very important date, the Balfour Declaration. And I relate here especially to the person, to the Zionist leader and scientist, very important scientist, Professor Chaim Weizmann, who was afterwards the first president of Israel. Chaim Weizmann, who was the father also of the aceton, which helped very much the British in the First World War, was also the a person who influenced the British government to create this Balfour Declaration, which was at that time a very big hope for the future of a Jewish homeland without knowing the date and knowing the borders, but even the hope was at that time very important. So from my point of view, Chaim Weizmann and Balfour Declaration is the first anchor of the 30 years that we cover here. At the same time, we have to mention also Nili. Nili was a small group, a clandestine intelligence group of very motivated young Jewish from the center of Israel, from Zichron Yaakov and that area. It was very brave at that time to take such an initiative to help the British against the Turks, against the Ottoman Empire that was the responsibility of Palestine. And although they failed afterward because the Turks caught them, but we know, even from the British point of view, that the contribution of Nili was very vital, and especially the branch in Cairo knew to appreciate very much Nili. The third station in my march of 30 years is the 3 years that were mentioned before very, very widely, the 3 years of the Great Arab Revolt from 36 to 39. Those 3 years, on one hand, were very bitter from casualties, from Jewish casualties point of view. On the other hand, they were very operational, both from the military point of view and the contribution of Wingate that was described, so amazing description of Shlomi Shitrit. And at that time, we also had a vital operation of settlement, almost 52 settlements in 3 years, what we called Chuma u'Migdal, were so important to the future homeland of the Jewish. And I see those 3 years from British point of view and from Israeli point of view, from the Zionist point of view, very influential. The next start, of course, from 1939, the start of World War II. World War II was covered before with the two fronts that we had. In the north of Vichy troops, the French Vichy troops, and from the southwest of Rommel troops. These two fronts of threat were segments of a very wide set of preparations from the British and from the Jews here. And fortunately, these two fronts were not transferred to a real penetration from north and south, but the preparations gave us a lot of experience in different segments. 1940 was also a new start of intelligence capability of Haganah, what was at that time called SHI, which is the intelligence service. We took the SIS term and took only the intelligence service abbreviation. And after 20 years, the Haganah was established, as we know, in 1920. And in the first 20 years, it was divided in many locations all over Palestine. But in 1940, especially with the framework of the Second World War, we understood that the leadership of the Jewish Agency and Haganah and the political department understood that we need a national service that will cover the different expertise of intelligence, with agents, with SIGINT, with visual intelligence, with the experience that was unique to the Jews at that time, and was very beneficial to the British, including the British intelligence organizations, knowing the Arab language, knowing the Arab culture, knowing the Arab different parameters, and the expertise of the Haganah, and especially the SHAI, the intelligence service, with a lot of connections in Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and the immigrants that came from different East European countries that were mentioned, Romania, Hungary, and ex-Yugoslavia. All the immigrants contributed a lot to the benefit, to the advantage of the Zionist Jewish intelligence services to the British. So if we see such a small organization like the SHAI, like the intelligence service, which gave its input to the Haganah and to the British, especially to the SOE that was mentioned before, this gave also to our staff the experience based on the symbiotic cooperation with the British. Another very important add to the experience that the Jewish community succeeded from the cooperation with the British is the participation with the British Army in Europe. 38,000, including 4,000 women, served in the British military, different services. 800 out of these thousands fall in this war. So even if you see the absolute numbers of the Jewish population in Palestine at those years, 38, almost 40,000 out of more than 500,000 inhabitants in Palestine, it is not only a symbolic number, it's an absolute number. When I talk nowadays in different circles in Israel, and I mention the number, even today, if we need to collect almost 40,000 volunteers to different missions, it's a very, very high achievement, and we did it. The result of the involvement of Jewish soldiers in the British army, as I said, in different services of the army, included some hundreds in the British intelligence, and they were very, very vital. And we know that at least in the 2 first decades of the state of Israel, those people who served in the British army and were afterwards in the service of the military intelligence of Mossad and Shabak and others that brought another experience, I cannot imagine, and I cannot think about a new state like Israel at that time that had immediately to cope with so many different kinds of threats without the intelligence and operational experience that we had before. Another very important, I think that we don't mention it a lot, but it was important also, it is important to mention the involvement of some Jewish experts in the very great achievement of the British deciphering the Enigma German code. At least 2 of them were very famous, Professor Gillis and Walter Eitan, 2 personalities that were afterwards in Israel in very major positions. And I think that not only those who came afterwards to Israel, but even other Jews that participated in the big secret project of the British Enigma, it is another experience that we have to mention. Some insights to conclude this forum and the different facts that we mentioned. I say we because I don't repeat to the presentations of Shlomo Shapiro and Shlomi Shitrit and Paul. There were ups and downs in the cooperation with the British. We should not ignore that the tension between the 2 parties, the Jewish part and the British side, there was a tension. One of the peaks of these tensions was at 1939 with the white paper, which was a shock to the Zionist movement and to the Zionist development in Palestine. The limitations of the settlements and the limitation to the immigration was very crucial, was very tragic. We had to, on one hand, to continue cooperating with the British, and on the other hand, to cope and to fight, really to fight against the British in different actions. This dilemma and this dual interest of the Jewish was also an internal conflict in the roles of the Jewish population here, and the fact that Haganah was divided afterwards with the separation of Etzel and Lehi. They were very anti-British, much more than the Haganah. The political leadership of the Jewish community in Palestine led a policy which was in double, if you want, in double interest. On one hand, we encouraged to volunteer to the British military. We encouraged to cooperate with the British intelligence. On the other hand, we understood that since the British troops and the British government in London and the British representation in Palestine limited very much the development of the Zionist Jewish entity here. As a last phrase, I can say that the symbiotic cooperation with the British in all the 30 years of the British mandate contributed a lot to the experience, the political experience, the operational experience, and the intelligence experience that brought afterwards to a very professional Ministry of Foreign Affairs based on the political department, a very professional military intelligence, Mossad and Shabak, the Israeli security agency. And I cannot check it in terms of numbers or percentage, but in every form that we check the history of the first years of Israel as a state and the first years of the different establishment that we built based on the 30 years of the British mandate, I think it was very important. And this forum of this evening is a good evidence with 4 different points of view from Israel and from UK. And I thank also Meteg, Ehud Shapira, that gave us the exposure to give this opportunity not only to the limited number that we could do it before. And I thank you all. And I'm sure that this is only a first initiative. And especially thank to Erez Meizel, our friend in the Association of the Haganah Heritage, that initiated with his colleagues in the UK this forum. And as I said, this is only the start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General and Dr. Lapid. We're sort of running out of time. I'd like to just say thank you to everyone who made this possible. We'll start, of course, with Meteg in Israel, and of course, Professor Shapira from the Europa Institute, the Bar-Ilan University, that I gave the opening remarks. Exceptional, really very interesting presentation by Chief Superintendent Shlomi Shitrit about Wingate, and that really set the mark for that. Moving on to Paul, which was really an eye-opener. I mean, I thought I knew some things, and tonight was even, I saw some really new and interesting things I didn't know before. We have much to work on, and when we meet up in December in Israel, we can talk about those things. And to you, Ephraim, thank you so much for that. I'd also like to say thank you very much to the ICD that supported it. So there's a bunch of younger people actually taking part. You don't see them. They normally have the black screens. There are a bunch of young non-commissioned officers with the liaison unit, the IDF liaison unit. They've got a bit of heritage and history tonight, which is great. And they'll be able to use that in the future when they work with their partners. Tal, of course, Major Tal that allowed this and supported us. Thank you so much for that as well. And I don't want to forget anyone, but there's plenty of others out there, such as Ajax and the police, and of course, Paul himself and the IICC. I think the most important takeaway of an evening like this is the audacity to try. I think that's the biggest thing that everybody learned from this meeting of minds, the meeting of opportunities and of operations during the Second World War between the British and the Haganah, but also the Irgun. The audacity to try something we've taken with all of us. And with that, I think I bid you all a really good night, and a safe night, and only good news. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll meet up again when we meet up. Thank you so much. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. תודה רבה.
Thank you very much and תודה רבה.
תודה רבה. להתראות.
Right.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Great.
Good night.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה לך. Great.
Thank you very much for this for the interesting evening.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Right. Good night.
תודה לכולם, תודה לארז,
תודה לך.
תצולתי,
לילה טוב.
לילה
לילה
טוב.
טוב.
לילה טוב. לילה טוב. תודה, אפרים.
תודה לכולם, היה מדהים.
תודה לאהוד.
אכן.
תודה, חגי.
תודה לכם. ערב מאוד מעניין.
תודה רבה, חגי.
כן.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב.
טוב.
לילה טוב.